morning. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you so very much for joining us today for this very exciting edge of your seat discussion with Dan. This week, we begin our annual year-end fundraising drive. As a small nonprofit, your contributions are absolutely essential to our operations and the production of these live streams. At the end of this live stream, you'll see a text to give information. We are so grateful for your support. I know you all have so many questions for Dan. Please type your questions into the panel on the right-hand side of the screen, and Jessica will be managing them in about 20-25 minutes. Dan, it's time to bring you on. We have been waiting for your counsel and guidance. You have three terrific topics today. Trump, Biden, still undecided. What comes next? What happened on Tuesday night and what didn't happen? And how a divided country moves forward. So please lead us away here, Dan. Thank you so much.
Well, Kim, I will admit that coming up with topic this week probably wasn't all that hard for us. Obviously, quite a bit going on. But as always, I want to join Kim in thanking all of you for joining us for this week's conversation. I know that many of you were with us on Tuesday for our Election Day discussion with Todd Purdom, and I think you'd agree that he really is phenomenal and he's a great person to spend Election Day with, or at least a portion of it. But even midday on Tuesday, I don't think we had any idea, or not many of us in any case did. We didn't have any idea on what Tuesday night was going to be like. And so we're going to go back in just a minute, as Kim mentioned, and talk about what happened and what didn't happen on Tuesday night. But given that there is so much news that has been developing since then about where this election is now headed, we thought that we would start by talking about what comes next. Here we are, it's the day after, and this election is still not concluded. So let me talk a little bit about where we're headed, and I'm going to talk about this in three different areas. So first, I'm going to talk about the vote counting that's actually taking place still in several states around the country. Then we're going to talk about the already starting legal activity that's going to continue for some time, even once the vote counting is done. And then third, we'll talk a little bit about the governing, which, barring some absolutely unexpected circumstance, will commence on January 20th of next year, just only a little bit more than 2 months away. So let's start. Let's talk about what's coming next, and we'll go back and look at the past election once we've gotten all up to speed on what's happening right now. So the first of those three items, like I said, is the vote counting. And as I'm guessing all of you know by now, I figure anyone who tunes into a webinar discussion like this one is keeping up on the news pretty well, all on your own. But just to sum up, there's 5 states around the country that we're still watching very, very closely. And the states of Arizona, of Georgia, of Nevada, of North Carolina, and of Pennsylvania. And it is entirely possible that we will know by the end of today results from at least a few of those states. Most likely Arizona and Nevada may report in, although Clark County, the largest county in Nevada by some margin, has made it clear that they might not have their final results for several days yet. But it appears that there's at least some possibility that Biden's lead would be large enough in Nevada for them to call that state by tonight. As all of you know, I'm sure, if Biden were to win the states of Arizona and Nevada, that would give him exactly 270 electoral votes, the very minimum threshold that he would need in order to become the president-elect. Now, we don't know, although Biden's ahead in both of those states, of course, we don't know if that will be the final outcome there. So we're still watching Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania as well. Georgia has gotten remarkably close. As more and more votes from Atlanta and the surrounding suburbs have come in, the margin in that state, as of about half an hour ago, was a mere 14,000 votes, with about 50,000 votes still to count. So it looks like that state might be headed to a recount. And in Pennsylvania, Biden is also gaining ground very rapidly. So we don't know yet Biden certainly looks like he has a much better chance of becoming president at this point than the likelihood of President Trump being reelected. But we'll continue to watch. And at least for today, those are the 5 states that we're keeping an especially close eye on. It's also worth mentioning just for a second, of course, the congressional elections for House and for Senate. And in the Senate, even if Republicans do end up coming up short in the presidential campaign, it's pretty clear that the Republican Party and the Republican candidates did better in both Senate and House races than had been expected. Right now, there are 50 Republican senators, or senators-elect as the case may be, 48 Democrats, including Bernie Sanders and Angus King of Maine, who are both technically independent, but who vote with the Democratic Senate caucus. And we're waiting right now, again, on the state of Georgia, where there is at least one Senate race, if not 2, that will be settled by a runoff election in the first week of January. As of about half an hour ago, David Perdue, the incumbent Republican senator in Georgia who is seeking re-election, is sitting at exactly 50% of the vote, with about a 1.5 lead over his Democratic challenger, Jon Ossoff. And this is important because if once the voting concludes in Georgia, Perdue has 50% of the vote, he will be reelected as senator. But if he has 49.9% of the vote or less, even if he's ahead of Ossoff, then that race will go to a runoff too. So again, we don't want to predict absolute outcomes here, but if Joe Biden is elected president, it looks very, very likely that he will face the Republican Senate in his at least his first 2 years in office. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later on when we get to questions of governing. If both of those 2 Georgia Senate races were to, in the runoff in January, vote for the Democratic candidate, Raphael Warner, in the special election, which is we already know is going to a runoff, and Jon Ossoff, as I mentioned a moment ago, who at least still has a chance of forcing a runoff in his race. If the Democrats were to win both of those races in the first week of January, that would leave a 50-50 tie in the Senate. And if Biden does become president, that means that Vice President Kamala Harris would probably be spending about as much time in the Senate as vice president as she did when she was a United States senator. It appears that very, very likely the Democrats will maintain control of the House of Representatives, although in somewhat of a surprise, it seems that their margin will be diminished rather than enhanced, and we can talk more about that a little bit later if you decide that that's something that you want to weigh in on. So that's the vote counting. We're watching Arizona and Nevada particularly closely right now, but Pennsylvania and Georgia could very well have wound up their counts by the end of the day. North Carolina looks like there'll be another week, given what the courts have said about allowing mail ballots to come in several days after the election. So once again, if Biden wins any two of these 5 states, he will become president. Trump needs to win 4 of the 5 in order to gain re-election. So let's move on now from the vote counting to what comes next. And for the sake of discussion, we're going to assume that Biden gets to 270 electoral votes, if only because he has a lead in the 2 states that would allow him to do so. But even if this race is resolved, even if these 5 states are counted and decided in the days ahead, we still have a long way to go before January 20th. And the Trump campaign has already made it very, very clear that they intend to mount legal challenges on many fronts in several states around the country in order to overturn some of these results. Now, these legal challenges fall into a couple of different categories. First, we're seeing what I'd call smaller scale challenges. And these are challenges in Michigan, in Georgia, in Nevada. These challenges are mainly about observers from both parties who are given the ability to watch the counting process. And as we remember from Florida in 2020, those of us who are old enough to have watched that, when these votes are counted, both parties are allowed to have observers in the room watching them. Republicans in each of those states has mounted a court appeal saying that their observers are not being given sufficient access to watching the vote counting process. Not just my own belief, but in talking to people who specialize in political and election law, I'm told that most of those challenges as it relates to vote counting and observations are generally likely to be resolved in real time by lower courts, by state courts. And it's very, very unlikely that a Supreme Court would overturn a presidential election on how much access the observers had to the vote counting process. We've already seen a couple of these legal challenges dismissed, but they're going to continue as long as the counting is going. But at least for right now, I wouldn't pay as much attention to them. We're also very likely to see recounts. I mentioned earlier that the state of Georgia at this point appears very, very likely to have a margin of less than 1% of their vote, which would allow for a recount in that state. In my home state of Wisconsin, the Trump campaign has already indicated that they will request a recount in that state. The way Wisconsin works is a little bit more complicated. If the result is within 0.2%, then the recount is automatic. But if it's larger than that, but still the margin between the two candidates is less than 1% of the vote, then it's not automatic. But the losing candidate has the ability to call for a recount. The Trump campaign has indicated they are going to call for a recount in Wisconsin. The way that state works is a recount can begin after all of the counties have certified their votes. Each county in Wisconsin has until November 17th, a week from Tuesday, in order to certify their votes. So that's when the recount would start. Scott Walker, the Republican former governor of Wisconsin, has already publicly warned the Trump campaign that a recount in Wisconsin is unlikely to be successful. The last two times there have been recounts in Wisconsin in a statewide race, the number of votes that changed, were about a little over 100 votes in one of the campaigns and about 300 votes in the other. While this is a very, very close race, keep in mind that several million votes were cast there. And so Biden is currently about 20,000 votes ahead of Trump. So while it appears that the Trump campaign is going to ask for a recall and that one will take place, and we may have to wait for a few weeks to have Wisconsin officially called, it seems very, very improbable that the recall would turn over enough votes to change the outcome there. Same thing in the state of, and as the last results votes come in Georgia, we'll be able to make a similar assessment there. The legal activity that really matters, though, is not the smaller scale challenges, the vote observing, and not even the recounts, because those are still some time off. Right now, there are legal challenges that are worth watching in the state of Pennsylvania and the state of North Carolina. And these are both states that allow votes to be counted if they are postmarked by Election Day, but arrive after Election Day, 3 days after in the case of Pennsylvania, that's today, or tomorrow, and 9 days after in the state of North Carolina. Now, the Supreme Court, as most of you know, has already ruled that counting votes that mail ballots that come in late, as long as they were postmarked by Election Day, is acceptable in both of those states. But the judges who dissented in those rulings, Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, and Justice Gorsuch, have indicated that they might want to reconsider these questions if they were to come before the court again. Well, here's the key here. The legal principle, as I've learned, is on which these decisions are made, on which Roberts and Kavanaugh have ruled in the past in other circumstances. The key legal principle on whether these votes should be counted or not is called a reliance interest. And the reliance interest generally protects voters who cast ballots relying on instructions, such as they'd be able to mail them by Election Day, even if they came in later. The reliance interest protects voters who cast ballots relying on instructions on how to vote legally from having that vote taken away. So nothing is guaranteed, of course, but it's reasonable to assume, based on legal precedent, that the court would use this reliance interest consideration in order to say that even if late arriving votes should not be counted, because people in Pennsylvania and North Carolina were told at the time that it was okay, that the assumption is that those votes would continue. So again, if Biden wins Arizona and Nevada, then we get to 270 electoral votes. The other thing to keep in mind, given that, is that the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, is unlikely to weigh in at all if they do not believe the election is at stake. In Bush versus Gore in 2000, the justices, as all of us were very aware that the election hung in the balance. But if it becomes clear that Biden has 270 electoral votes, it becomes much, much more improbable that a US Supreme Court would accept a challenge from one of these other states simply because there's no reason for them to interfere in a presidential election that's already been decided. In other words, the court doesn't want to decide an election unless there's no option. And so if Biden is at 270, these other challenges become much, much more difficult. So what's the bottom line here? Joe Biden is likely to win, but it may take a while, depending on the rest of the vote counting, depending on the recounts, and depending on these legal challenges. So what I'd like to do now is stop for just a minute and ask you guys to weigh in. Well, what we're going to talk about in just a minute is we're going to talk about governing. And Claire, I'm going to apologize to you because I'm pulling a fast one on you. We're going to talk, assuming that Biden does become president, we're going to talk about his governing challenges. And as I said a moment ago, it looks much more likely than not that Biden would face a Republican Senate, in taking office. It's worth noting that Joe Biden would be the first American president since George H.W. Bush in 1989 who took office without having both houses of Congress under the control of his party. And Biden would be the first Democratic president since Grover Cleveland in the 1880s to take office without the Democratic Party having a majority in both houses. That could be a case for gridlock, maybe not, but let's see what you think. Claire, can we do this? Can we put up? We sure can. Thank you, Claire Krelitz. The question for all of you, how effectively would Biden and a GOP Senate work together? What do you think? Very effectively? Somewhat effectively? Not effectively at all? And Claire, if we can hold off for just a minute or two in putting up the results, I'm going to offer you a couple of thoughts before we see what all of you think. One option, of course, is gridlock, and that a Democratic president and a Republican Senate leader would be at loggerheads for at least the next 2 years, if not more. The other option, though, which it seems to me is at least worth considering, is remembering that during the Obama administration, when President Obama and Republicans in Congress got to gridlock on issues, on budgetary issues, matters and others, it was generally Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell, who frankly don't care for each other that much, but both of whom have been around long enough to remember when Washington was able to work in a bipartisan way when absolutely necessary, that often it was Biden and McConnell who went behind closed doors and was able to work out a deal that less experienced politicians in both parties weren't able to. So I wouldn't bet the rent money on this, but at least one other outcome to consider, other than the more predictable gridlock, is that these two very experienced politicians, having experienced a time period in which the two parties could at least occasionally put aside their differences, it's worth at least wondering whether that might be the case here. Claire, let's see what everybody thinks on how likely that is. Very effectively, 2%. That's not very much. 61% say somewhat effectively. So maybe the majority agree with at least partially with that possibility that I raised a moment ago. And 37%, more than a third, said that Biden and the Senate would not work together effectively at all. So very, very interesting. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to go on to our second topic and talk about what happened on Tuesday night and what didn't happen. And Claire, so let's go back to what we had planned as the first question. And before I get started, let's ask everyone who's joining us today what their assessment was. Question for all of you, how would you summarize your assessment of the presidential election? Number one, I thought Biden would win by a wider margin. 2, I thought Trump would win. 3, this is what I expected. And we'll go into a little bit more detail with a follow-up question in just a minute, asking you to talk about where the surprises were. But for right now, we wanted to start out more broadly. And when we have those results clear, if we can put them out, 75%, 3/4 of us, thought that Biden would win by a wider margin. And of course, that's what most public opinion polls showed. And we can talk about that later if you like. 5% thought Trump would win, so surprised for a different reason. 20% said this is what I expected. And what I'll say with all due respect to that 20%, so I'm not entirely sure I believe you. But if this really is what you expected, then I must say I am very, very impressed. And I may have to take you to Las Vegas at some point, once Clark County has finished counting its presidential ballots at least. So let's now, before I get into my thoughts, Claire, let's put up one more question. Let's dig a little bit deeper with this group. And for those 80% who were surprised, and even for the other 20% as well, what state was the biggest surprise for you? Was it Florida, where the Biden campaign thought that they had a really good chance, and Trump won by what seems to is clearly a fairly decisive margin? What was once the key swing state of Ohio, which has now become very reliably Republican? Was it Wisconsin, which appears to be going for Biden, but only by a very, very small amount? Similarly, Michigan, Biden was ahead in both of these states by pretty decent sized margins in the polls. And if he does win them, which it appears to be the case now, it'll be very, very close. Or was Texas a big surprise to you? Because early in the night, it looked like Biden might be prepared to pull an upset there, which ended up not being the case. So which of those 5 states was the biggest surprise to all of you? 41%. Wow. 41% were most surprised by Florida, and the rest are pretty well distributed. 20% for Wisconsin, 11% for Ohio, 14% for Michigan, 14% for Texas. So Florida was clearly the big surprise for a lot of us. And now that we're shifting the conversation to what happened on Tuesday night, let's talk about what happened. Now, the biggest, what I would say, the most unexpected outcome, at least for most of us, was the way that the Trump campaign was able to turn out his base. We've been talking all year long. We've been talking for months. Some of you have been participating in these webinars since back in the spring. We've been talking all year long about how Trump's campaign strategy has been based exclusively on exciting and inspiring and motivating his most loyal supporters to turn out on election day. Most predominantly, these white working class voters who've been so instrumental to his political success in the past. And we've talked about how that strategy, while plausible, really didn't leave Trump a very large margin for error. And you know what? He turned out his base. It was a strategy all along, and it ended up working much better than most people expected, although we don't know yet whether it worked quite well enough or not. But even though many experts doubted it, the Trump campaign was able to turn out white working class voters in even higher numbers than they were 4 years ago. Because what they identified early on is a lot of voters from this group who were registered in 2016 but didn't vote. And the Trump campaign spent an enormous amount of time and money convincing them that it was worth coming to the polls. And whether it was ultimately successful or not, we'll know in the days ahead. But I think one of the reasons so many people were surprised, the most important reason so many people were surprised, was that those white working class voters turned out for Trump exactly the way they needed to in order for Trump to make this a competitive election. In Ohio, probably in North Carolina, possibly in Iowa, these are the voters that won those states for Trump. In Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, these are the voters that made these states much closer than public opinion polls had expected. And make no mistake about it, these white working class voters are the voters who saved the United States Senate for the Republican Party. Because as you look around the country where Republicans held on to seats that were endangered, in North and South Carolina, in Maine, in Montana, in Kansas, these were the voters that won the states for the Republican candidates. Another thing that happened on election night, most notably in Florida, as many of you focused on, was some unexpected trending with the Latino vote. And as we've talked about in this webinar before, the Latino vote in this country is not monolithic. And as Latino and Latina voters become the largest minority voter group in this country, it might be worth realizing that even talking about the Latino vote, using that phrase, referring to the Latino vote, is like referring to the human vote, because there's a lot of different voters who have either come to this country or whose parents or grandparents have come to this country, from Mexico, from Central or South America, or from countries in the Caribbean. And they've come for a lot of different reasons, or their parents did or their grandparents did. They're at much different stations in their life, and they vote in very different ways. And what the Trump campaign did very successfully is they convinced Cuban American and Venezuelan and Nicaraguan voters to turn out in large numbers for Trump to a much greater degree than they had 4 years ago. And Biden was not able to match Hillary Clinton's support among Latino and Latina voters, not just in Florida, where it was most noticeable, but in Texas and other parts of the country as well. What else did we see on Tuesday night? We saw that suburban voters and older voters, two of the key swing groups that polls showed shifting toward Biden over the course of this calendar year, we saw that these suburban voters and these older voters did shift toward Biden, just not in the types of numbers that had been predicted. And my own feeling on this, and we'll have to wait for more data in order to come to a more definitive conclusion, but my own gut on this is that these older voters and that these suburban voters, while they shifted to Biden, one of the reasons they didn't do it in as large numbers had been expected was that Trump was able to use issues relating to crime and law enforcement and public safety to a much better end from his standpoint than had been expected. Voters generally told pollsters that those issues were not motivating them, but we've known for years, if not decades, that suburbanites and seniors are those who generally tend to be most attuned to public safety and criminal justice issues. And my own feeling is that Trump's emphasis on those types of things may have allowed him to keep from losing as many votes from those two key groups as he might have otherwise. And then finally, what did we learn on Tuesday night? We learned that the pandemic, that the coronavirus, was not nearly as much of a voting issue as we had expected it would be. In the exit polls by Edison, the gold standard on these things, we found that only 20% of voters on election day, or who voted by mail, only 20% of voters, I should say, only 20% of voters said that the coronavirus was the most important issue in this campaign to them. 33% of the respondents, 33% of the voters said it was the economy. 60% of Trump voters said that the economy was the most important issue to them. 70% of Trump voters in Florida, 80% of Trump voters in Ohio, those key swing states, voted on the economy, not on COVID. And that clearly elevated Trump in a way that many people had not expected. Lots more to talk about. And our third topic, perhaps our most important one, is how a divided country moves forward. But we do have a lot to cover today. And so perhaps what we can do now, Jessica, is bring in the questions from our participants, and maybe at the close talk a little bit about how we move forward. And if not, maybe we make that the centerpiece of next week's conversation. So Jessica, if you're willing to rejoin me, then maybe we can get started on questions.
Great. Yeah, we're getting a lot of questions about the polls and how the polls could be so wrong and what that means for the industry going forward. How could they have been so wrong?
Okay, so the Gallup poll, which is considered to be the gold standard in public opinion research in this country and around the world, some years ago decided that they would no longer do any so-called horse race polling. They would still poll on politics. They'd ask us what we thought of the candidates, if we thought of them favorably or unfavorably, what we liked and didn't like about them. Gallup asked us about the issues, which issues are most important and what we wanted to see done on them. But Gallup simply stopped asking the horse race questions. Are you voting for Trump or for Biden? Are you voting for candidate A or for candidate B? And the reason they did that is because, as we've talked about in this webinar before, public opinion polls are not designed to predict the future. Public opinion polls, the best of them, are designed to tell us what voters are thinking about and why they're thinking about those matters. And I think it's just a matter of human nature, because we're all impatient to want to know what's going to happen before it does. And because it's the media's nature, recognizing that polls are of great interest and excitement to their audience, even though we know in our hearts that polls are not designed to be predictive, that they're a snapshot in time, as we've talked about many times before, we can't help ourselves. We can't help looking at a poll and saying, okay, even if the election is a month, a week, even a few days away, we're going to assume that this poll is going to tell us what's going to happen. And what Gallup recognized is, since human nature and the nature of news media is such that we'll never get away from asking polls to predict the future, even though they can't, Gallup just doesn't ask the horse race question anymore. And my hope is, going forward, that other reputable polling organizations will come to the same conclusion. So by 2022 and 2024, we can use polling for what it was intended to do, to tell us what people are thinking about and why they're thinking about it, as opposed to asking public opinion polling to do something that's not designed to do, and, as we've learned again, is not always capable of doing. So did the polls predict the future? No, they didn't. But even though intellectually know that, in our gut, in our hearts, we still want the pollsters to be fortune tellers. And this is just another reminder that they aren't.
Thank you. Legislators often quote public opinion polls when they propose laws related to gun control, healthcare, etc. But the only time we can test the reliability of polls is in elections. Shouldn't legislators reconsider their reliance on public opinion polls going forward?
Well, I think public opinion research, at least the kind that I've just defined, that surveys people on issues, on attitudes, on priorities, can be a valuable resource. But the question is exactly right in one regard. Polling should be one resource that an elected official relies on when moving forward on public policy. It certainly shouldn't be the other. Any decent leader, Democrat, Republican, Green, Libertarian, Vegetarian, whoever it is, any decent leader should be cognizant of polls and realize that there is public support for a particular idea or not. But any elected official who's governed solely by the polls isn't leading, they're following. And so I think including polling as part of the equation, as opposed to the dominant part, would be an important step in the right direction. So I might not go quite as far as the questioner did, but elected officials, just like the rest of us, should take these polls in some context.
Someone is asking about the financial incentives of polling organizations. So given the billions of dollars that were spent on this election, how realistic is it to expect polling organizations to give up their cash cow?
Well, I don't think we can ask polling organizations to give up their cash cow. And in fact, we should point not to the polling organizations themselves, but rather to the media organizations that sponsor these polls, who provide the platform from which we all see these polling results. If I run a polling company, I don't make more or less money depending on how many people pay attention to that poll. But a news organization, whether a newspaper, whether a television station, whether a website, does profit based on the size of its audience. And what news organizations understand is that because we as voters can't help ourselves, that polls are going to attract a greater audience. So the question is a really smart one, but I wouldn't put it in the lap of the polling companies, who are going to make a profit, not a huge one, but they're going to make a profit either way, at least during an election year. But the question is whether the media organizations on whom we rely can restrain themselves and say to the polling companies, we'd like to do what Gallup does. We'd like your issue polling, we like your attitude polling, we like your priority polling, but we don't want to see the Smith versus Jones polling anymore because we know that it's misleading. News media, with the exception of public broadcasting and a few nonprofits in this country, are privately owned businesses. They're for-profit businesses. So I don't think we're going to see polling go away. But I think we are going to see some introspection on the part of the most reputable news organizations about whether that horse race polling should continue to be a part of what they do or not.
Thank you. What is the usual ratio of someone casting a ballot for president, but not for a House or Senate seat on a ballot? For example, in Pennsylvania, 200,000 voted for Biden, but not for any down ballot races.
That's actually pretty typical. Presidential campaign gets much more attention than campaigns for governor or for Senate or for House, which get more attention than campaigns for legislature or for school board or for city council or for school board. So we generally do tend to see a pretty considerable drop off going down ballot. What's changed though, and what I think some of you might find interesting, is the nature of that down ballot decision making. It used to be, and we've talked about this before, it used to be that many of the American people were what we call ticket splitters. They would vote for one party's candidate for president and the other party's candidate for Senate or for House in order to keep an eye on the president. Or they'd vote for one party, they'd vote for a Democrat for governor, but a Republican for legislature, or vice versa. So even if you want a governor of your own party, you don't trust him or her entirely. So you want the other side there to balance things out, to keep an eye on them as well. And that ticket splitting is based on the presumption that both parties are made up of decent and honorable people who just happen to have different beliefs and different ideas about how we ought to resolve society's challenges and a community's problems. If you stop believing that both parties are decent and honorable people and start believing that the other party is made up of people who are stupid or evil, you're a lot less incentivized to split your ticket. And so in the United States Senate, for example, I think this is one of the reasons Republicans have held control of the Senate, it appears, through this election, is in the 2016 and the 2020 presidential elections. In those two campaigns combined, there were 68 elections for US Senate between 2016 and 2020. 68 US Senate campaigns in which people in one state or another voted on. In 67 of those, voters of that state, whatever state it was, voted for a candidate for president and for Senate of the same party. Another way of saying that is in 67 out of those 68 races, the man or woman who won the Senate race was of the same party as the president who carried that state. Susan Collins' victory in Maine on Tuesday was the only one of 68 campaigns for the United States Senate in which the people of a state voted for one party's candidate for president, in this case Biden, and the other party's candidate for Senate, in this case Collins. So when you don't just prefer your own party over the other, when you actually hate the other party, despise them, ticket splitting goes away. And we end up seeing much more straight ticket voting, not just in president and senatorial races, but all the way down the ballot.
Thank you. Do you find it surprising that the Trump campaign was able to turn out a bigger percent of Black men relative to when he ran against Hillary? You've also commented on his improvements with Latinos, as well as improvements with Muslim voters and Native Americans. Do these results signal a fundamental realignment and an entrenchment of Trumpist ideas that have taken over the Republican Party?
Well, I guess a couple of things going on here. One, as we talked about earlier, the changes in the Latino vote are pretty pronounced. In both the Latino and the African American community, we see an immense gender gap. Female Latinas and female African American voters still vote overwhelmingly Democratic. Where Trump made up a little bit of ground was among male voters. And so just like we see a gender gap in every other community in America, Republicans are more likely to attract male voters, Democrats are more likely to attract female support. It shouldn't be surprising that we see this in communities of color as well. The other thing that seems to be going on in these two communities is not just a gender gap, but a generational gap, where Trump was able to improve his support in the African American and Latino community was particularly among young men. And there's all sorts of suppositions as to why that's the case. Some people believe that a younger male of any racial or ethnic heritage is more likely to prioritize economic issues than the pandemic. Young men tend to feel a little bit invulnerable about themselves in their lives. And so if you don't think that if you don't think that COVID can hurt you, you might be less likely to make that your voting issue. There are some commentators, and I'm not educated enough to tell you whether they're right or not, I'll just simply pass on their analysis, is that in the among young male Latinos, that there's somewhat of a machismo factor, their word, not mine, that Trump, who tends to be a very assertive and sometimes combative presence, is the type of persona that would appeal to a younger Latino man, and in some cases as well, to a younger African-American male as well. Although this vote, particularly as it relates to Latinos, was key in the state of Florida, it's worth noting that while Trump did do slightly better among African-American voters, it wasn't a huge difference. He drew 8% of the African-American vote in 2016, maybe 11 or 12% this year. So it's an increase. And I would note that if Joe Biden does become president, it will almost certainly be because African-American voters in cities like Atlanta and Milwaukee and Detroit and Philadelphia turned out in sufficient numbers to help him carry their states.
Do you have any commentary on why Trump lost white male voters? Because he lost a significant number.
The white male voters that Trump lost tended to be much more suburban voters, white male voters of higher income, and white male voters of the college education. We talked a little bit earlier about the gender gap and the generational gap, but one of the most profound divisions that's emerging in American society is an education gap. Trump just dominated with voters who did not have a college education. Biden was much more successful in taking away voters who were college educated from him. And this is a reversal because for many years, Democrats did much better with voters who didn't benefit from higher education. That trend, that shift began well before Trump, but Trump has exaggerated it, or has intensified it, I should say. And so where he has lost votes, where Trump lost votes to Biden among white male voters, was particularly white male voters with a college degree, and to some degree white male voters of higher income. And this is part of a broader cultural split that we're seeing in the country. Voters of higher income who tend to be less comfortable with some of the more confrontational aspects of Trump's approach to governance.
Do you think there were any shifts with mail-in voting compared to being able to vote in a booth with families? So people sitting around the table and maybe hashing it out as well.
That's a really interesting question. As I mentioned a moment ago, we know that there's an immense gender gap in this country, which means logically that a lot of marriages, at least marriages between two people of two different genders, were somewhat likely to have parents or partners voting for two different candidates. And I haven't seen any reliable research on whether the fact that we were voting in person, face to face with each other rather than in a voting booth may have influenced some votes or not. It's a fascinating question. I wouldn't venture an answer until some research emerges to either prove or disprove it. Really interesting question, though.
Thanks. Biden raised and spent more than double what Trump spent. Does this election put to rest, at least at a high level, the question of whether pouring money into a campaign has a direct correlation to the outcome? And somebody else also asked about the money that Bloomberg paid into the Get Out the Vote in Florida, and that didn't seem to pan out.
So we've always known that paid media and advertising has a much greater impact in down ticket races than it does in presidential campaigns. And the reason for that is pretty simple, because the news media covers presidential campaigns to a much greater degree than they cover campaigns for school board or for city council or for legislative office. And so what that means is the information that we get about presidential candidates from paid advertising is a much smaller percentage of our overall base of information about them than about candidates running for local or legislative office. So the fact that Biden was able to outspend Trump by such a tremendous margin allowed Biden to compete more heavily in many more states. And if he ultimately does become president, that funding advantage will have served him well, because it allowed him to advertise heavily, not just in a few states, but in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and Arizona and some of these other places. Whereas the Trump campaign really had to pick and choose where they were spending their money. But we've known for some time that paid advertising doesn't make as big of a difference in a presidential race. What I think might have mitigated the difference to an even greater degree than normal for Trump is that the Trump campaign, remember, since late spring, has had its staff and its volunteers campaigning in communities face-to-face and door-to-door. Whereas the Biden campaign, until the last few weeks of the election, out of concerns of the coronavirus, relied on phone and email and text and online campaigning. So I think one lesson to learn from this campaign is how important that person-to-person voting is. And even while Trump and his campaign were willing to risk transmittal of the virus, there's no question that particularly among lower income voters, and to some degree, particularly among Latino voters, that person-to-person contact really is much more impactful than television advertising is. Again, at least in a presidential race.
Thank you. Lots of talk about how many Dems are irate over losing seats in the House. And then also, would you agree that Trump's tailcoats was much longer than polls and Democrats expected? So I guess based on some of the House elections and some of the different seats that were shifted.
Well, two good questions there. And it is fairly clear that unlike 2018, where Trump was not on the ballot and Democratic House candidates succeeded to a very significant degree, that this year, with Trump's name at the top of the ballot, that Republican House candidates did do much better. And this goes back to this ticket splitting or lack thereof that we were talking about earlier. More than 95% of Donald Trump's voters voted for a Republican for the House of Representatives. Slightly less than that number, but still well over 90% of Biden's voters supported a Democrat for House in their district. And so the coattails that the questioner asks about are very real, not just for Donald Trump, but for presidential candidates of both parties. Because as we become more and more polarized and more balkanized as an electorate and a society, we're much less likely to cross party lines when we vote down ballot. No question that Trump's presence at the top of the ballot helped him in red states, but also helped him here in states like California. Because even though Trump lost this state by a very large margin, districts where there were competitive House races, we've seen how much the Republican candidates did benefit from his presence on the ballot.
Yeah, and I've seen some analysis to talk about the split too, is that there were in Georgia a lot of people that were voting for Biden, but that were also voting for Perdue, which was kind of an interesting, I don't know how many there were, but they were seeing shifts going that way as the votes were coming in.
Well, if Biden does carry Georgia, and if Perdue is reelected, then 2 Senate races out of the 68 that have taken place over the last 2 cycles will have involved that kind of ticket splitting. But whether it's 1 out of 68 or 2 out of 68, let's agree it's much more the exception than the rule.
Cool. What caused certain outlets, including especially Fox News, to call Arizona for Biden?
So there are 2 assessment entities, for lack of a better term, that the media relies on for its election day forecasts. One of those is a consortium on which the 3 broadcast networks and CNN rely. It's called Edison Research and is held in very, very high regard. But after the 2016 campaign, the Associated Press, a very, very respected print news organization, decided for any number of reasons that they didn't want to be part of the Edison consortium anymore, so they started their own. And Fox News Channel decided, not because AP is liberal or conservative, it is pretty even-handed in its news coverage, even more than most daily newspapers are, is the people at Fox decided that the Associated Press method of assessing election day results was preferable to that of Edison, that the broadcast networks and CNN rely on. So Fox News, they go to great lengths, as does CNN and as do the broadcast networks, they go to great lengths to keep their analytic team completely isolated from their journalists. And in 2012, for some of you with long memories, when Obama was running for re-election against Romney, Karl Rove was a guest analyst on Fox. And when Fox called certain states for Obama, Rove was outraged and he dismissed what the Fox data and analysts were doing. And so Megyn Kelly, who was then an anchor on Fox News, actually went down the hallway, found the head analyst, I believe by the name of Arnold Mishkin, although I might not have that right, is completely separate and takes pride in being even-handed and nonpartisan in his analysis. Megyn Kelly walked down the hallway with her camera, or with her camera person, and interviewed the Fox analyst, who explained why he, the analyst, was right and why Karl Rove was wrong. So it is worth noting that while Fox News obviously has a very strong conservative bent, that the people who make these decisions for them take justifiable pride in staying isolated from the newsroom and from their commentators. Fox and Associated Press made the decision on Arizona because, according to their calculations, the number of outstanding ballots in Arizona, while Trump could technically catch up if he won all or most of them, what they were judging is the communities in which those outstanding votes existed. And so what they saw is that many of the mail votes that had not yet been counted in Arizona came from more left-leaning counties and precincts, where the votes in the areas that were tended to be more heavily for Trump didn't have as many votes left. I wouldn't say that Edison or the Associated Press is right or wrong on this. They're two smart groups of people who occasionally are going to disagree, the same way two stock analysts are going to disagree on which stock to buy and which to sell.
Thank you. We've got several questions about the ballot measures that we're here in California. So someone says, if we can also talk about California, in light of the narrow defeat of Prop 15, do you foresee a continued effort to weaken or repeal Prop 13 protections?
So. I think we should do this. I'll certainly answer the question, but because we've been focusing so much on national news, and ballot initiatives and other political happenings in California are so important, Jessica, let's make an agreement right now that one of our 3 topics next Thursday will be to talk about California elections, not just the ballot initiatives, but some of the most important candidate races as well. And one of the reasons we're waiting a week to do that, rather than talking about it in too much depth and detail today, is, of course, in California, ballots that are mailed by Election Day can still be counted if they arrive at the polling, at the election offices 17 days after the election. So while it appears that Proposition 15, the adjustment to the Proposition 13 property tax initiative, while it appears that Prop 15 is losing, we don't know that for certain yet. We won't know for sure for another week or two. If it does end up coming up short, and as I think most of you know, Proposition 15 would have retained the property tax protections for residential property, but would have allowed property taxes for commercial properties with a value of more than $3 million to go up. It does look like that initiative will be unsuccessful. We don't know for sure. If it doesn't pass, the main 2 reasons it would not have passed is, one, many voters believe the argument made against it, that if property tax protections were taken away for commercial property, that the next step would be to repeal Proposition 13 altogether and eliminate those protections for residential properties and homes as well. The other argument that the opposition made is that while a commercial property in its entirety might be worth more than $3 million, there's many small businesses, coffee shops, restaurants, dry cleaners, and so on, who rent space in larger commercial concerns. And that even if property taxes only went up for those properties that were worth more than $3 million, those additional costs would get passed on to the dry cleaners in the coffee shops and so on. If the initiative does not come back and pass in the polls, I don't think it'll be the last effort we see to reform Proposition 13. But if they were not able to pass this initiative, in a presidential year in which the Democratic candidate carried the state by such an immense margin, even though this debate will continue in the future, this might have been the best chance for passing a reform of Prop 13 that we'll see in California for some time.
Great. And so Jane and David, I will hold your questions for next week on the affirmative action ballot measure as well. Going forward, with reapportionment and redistricting coming up, were there any notable flips in the control of state houses across the country?
There were not, which is to the benefit of Republicans. Just as Democrats thought that they would gain seats in the U.S. Senate and U.S. House, there were several state legislatures where the Democrats in those states felt that they could swing the balance of power, swing the majority from Republican to Democrat. For the most part, that did not happen. There may be a state or two where Democrats are able to claim a majority, but just as the Democratic Party came up short in House and Senate races, it appears that they did in legislative campaigns around the country. Jessica, if I can, what I'd like to do is take a few minutes, knowing that we'll be talking about this next week and for weeks to come, is I do want to spend a few minutes to wrap up talking about the third topic that we laid out at the beginning of the program today.
Great.
We had spoken about what's happening next in the election. We talked about what happened on Tuesday. What I'd like to do, if I can, for just a few minutes for all of you, is look beyond even January 20th. And the third topic we laid out was how a divided country moves forward. Because what we learned, regardless of how this election is resolved, even if Joe Biden becomes president, what we learned is that Donald Trump's election in 2016 was not an aberration or an accident. The type of blue wave that many expected would have demonstrated that Trump was an unusual interruption in American politics. And as Biden talked about through most of his campaign, he talked about getting back to normal. I think what we have to realize, whether in California or elsewhere around the country, is given how close this campaign was, this is normal now in our country. And so the divisions, the bitterness, the combativeness on both sides, what we've seen over the last 4 years, and I know it's not a particularly pleasing thought, regardless of who's president, was not a one-off. It was not an exception. It was not an aberration or an accident. This is what American politics, and therefore this is what America is now. And that's something that we all need to think about, not necessarily our political leaders, because these differences, these divisions, these suspicions are not going to be solved in Washington, D.C. Politicians in both parties will always represent their side of that division. It's really on us to figure out a way how to talk to each other. The divisions that I talked about earlier in our country, by gender, by age, by race, by education level, and perhaps most importantly, this immense urban-rural divide, the divide between our cities and inner suburbs on one hand versus small town and rural communities on the other, is growing larger and larger every year. And more of us have lost the opportunity or lost the memory of how we even talk to each other. If Biden does hold on and win, that means that 48% of our country will be very bitterly disappointed. And how we talk to that almost half of the country in a constructive way is going to be an incredible challenge, regardless of whether you voted for Trump or for Biden. So we have one more poll question I'd like to put to everybody. Claire, can we put our fourth question up on screen? And I know we normally don't poll at the close, but I'd like to ask you guys to answer this. And I'd remind you that your answers are anonymous. Your identity is not something we know or share, so I hope you'll answer honestly. My question is, how many existing friendships do you have with someone who voted for the other candidate, Trump or Biden? And by friendship, I would say somebody who in a non-COVID circumstance, you would see socially in a non-professional setting, someone you'd meet for lunch or for coffee or for dinner. So how many friends do you have among those who voted for the other candidate? 20%, 1 out of 5 of us says none. 32% said just 1 or 2. That means more than half of us have no or few friends who voted for the other candidate. 24% of us, almost a quarter, have half a dozen friends or more. and on the other side, and that's encouraging. But what I would say, regardless if you said none or more than 10 or anywhere in between, is we have to do better. We have to set an example for our elected representatives and realize that just because someone votes for another party or another candidate doesn't mean that they're stupid or evil. It means more often than not always, but much more often than not, they're a good, decent person too who wants to see us address the problems our communities and our country face as well. And we need to figure out a way to start talking to each other again. There's a speech that Bill Clinton gave some years ago, right after the Sandy Hook tragedy, that I think I've shared with you in the past, which I'll reference again, and then we'll wrap up maybe a minute or two late, and I apologize for that. But right after the horrific shooting at Sandy Hook, former President Bill Clinton went to talk to a Democratic National Committee meeting. And what Clinton told that assemblage, what he told them is he said, hey, you know I'm with you on guns. He said, you know, I fought for background checks. I fought for the assault weapons ban. I'm with you every step of the way, Bill Clinton said to the Democratic National Committee members. He said, but here's our problem. I know a lot of good people in Arkansas, and they think that we think that they're stupid. And as long as they think that we think that they're stupid, there's no way in the world we're ever going to be able to have a constructive conversation with them about guns or about anything else. And so what I'd leave all of you with today is for us to think about, and thanks to Kim and Jessica and Claire and the good people at LA World Affairs Council, we'll look for platforms and forums through which to do it. We need to find a way to talk to people with whom we disagree in a respectful way, even if we vehemently disagree with them. Because I don't know about all of you, but I've never convinced anybody of anything by telling them how stupid they were. With that, we are a couple of minutes over, so Kim, you better come back and rescue our poor audience from my monologue.
I don't think they need rescuing, Dan. I think they enjoy every moment. And for those of you who want more of Dan Schnur, we are actually having a post live stream members only talk starting in a few minutes, where members can actually interactively connect with Dan, ask him questions directly, and we can see each other on the screens. It's much more of a communal experience. And I think if you would like to become a member and join in this process, we would welcome you with open arms. And again, please, we need your help to keep all of these wonderful programs going. So please text Schnur, which is so appropriate, to the number on the screen and give what you can. We really, really appreciate your support. We have a terrific lineup next week. On Monday, World in Danger, Germany and Europe in an Uncertain Times with former German ambassador to the US and the UK. And on Tuesday, how Qatar free zones are expanding trade tech and diplomacy in the Middle East. We have the Minister of State from Qatar on Tuesday. And of course, politics in the time of coronavirus next Thursday. Everybody stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you next Monday. See you in a minute, Dan.
Thanks, everybody.